Hey assessment students, it is Dr. Ryder, and this is an assessment sidebar video that is provided for you on the topic of assessment ethics. And this video is meant to provide a bridge between our intro class discussion where we talked about some of the differences and similarities or overlaps of research, evaluation, and assessment, and what you all have been working on in this sort of interlude between the first class and the second class on topics related to ethical conduct of research through the CITI training or the CITI training. And some of you will be completing this CITI training for the first time. Others of you probably have done it in a previous course. So, for example, a research course that you've had here at UNCW. And so you're just submitting your previous scores. So hopefully this video will provide you with an important sort of reminder about some of these concepts, because they will appear a little bit later in the course, perhaps on a quiz that is scheduled for later in the semester. I'm just kind of giving you a little bit of a heads up there. So without further ado, let's get down to it. So in our first class meeting, we talked about assessment evaluation and what some of its sort of key characteristics were, and we did so by comparing them to research and looking at some things that were clearly very similar in terms of some of the methods. Although there certainly are some differences there too. They kind of have different reasons or different purposes, but one of the big things that they have in common is that research, at least in social and behavioral sciences such as higher education, very much like assessment and evaluation work, is done using human participants or human subjects. And so one of the things that makes the CITI training important, even though it is offered for you in the or is designed around the context of research, and assessment and evaluation work is typically not judged to rise to that same sort of level because it's not generalizable. We still apply the CITI principles or those principles found in the Belmont Report for ethical principles and guidelines for the protection of human subjects. And it's because, just because we're not doing research and we're doing something else doesn't mean that we all of a sudden just want to kind of throw these ethical principles and guidelines out the window and, belittle assessment and evaluation monsters because we're not providing ethical treatment and care and serving those obligations to the people from whom we're collecting data. So yeah, we can slide that over and we can apply the Belmont Report in both contexts. So one of the reasons why the Belmont Report came into being, and it came into being as a way to firmly and clearly articulate the guidelines for ethical conduct of research with human subjects, was because as wonderful and amazing as science is, and as so many great innovations that it's brought to us, such as the ability to provide the screencast video for you, the ability for someone like Mr. Bill Nye there to have his 3D glasses and see 3D movies, though it seems as though this meme photograph is kind of trying to pass them off as like solar eclipse glasses, perhaps. I don't know. In either case, those are both innovative. But science has also perpetrated some stuff that in the name of science and scientific advancements has been kind of sketchy to pretty incredibly horrible in terms of how people have been treated and regarded. And so as you read or experienced through the CITI training, or to kind of refresh your memory, it was it was some of these horrible things that had occurred previously that motivated scientists, social scientists, to come together and to kind of say, this is what we believe, and these are the things that must be done in order to protect the rights of participants, and to treat them with respect and with kindness and a sense of humanity in research studies. And we don't say this or do this and kind of have you as graduate students adhere to these guidelines and principles in this course because we expect that you're going to do really horrible, monstrous things in your assessment and evaluation projects, but it's because there are slippery slopes that, um, by virtue of, not doing something just so, is a violation of these principles, and is a way in which you have denied someone, these sort of basic protections under human subjects research, even, when the consequences may not seem like they're that big of a deal. And so it's as much part of the discipline of conducting research and engaging in data collection activities with human subjects and participants, whether they're there in real time or you are reviewing evidence that's kind of been left behind, such as a portfolio of leadership activities or even student coursework. But we want to show respect in all aspects of the data collection and the interactive process with human subjects and their materials. So it's why this is incredibly important. We got to the point of needing the Belmont report and people kind of saying, we've got to do something about this. Through a few sort of key and really pretty terrible sort of examples. And so you may be familiar with the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. That was what the study was formerly called. And it was carried out between 1932 and 1972 by the U.S. Public Health Service, which was a forerunner of the Centers for Disease Control. That's now under the Department of Health and Human Services. And of course, the CDC does excellent work, keeps the American public very, very healthy and very safe now from all sorts of different pathogens, and identifies through weekly and monthly, really probably daily alerts, different sorts of, advents or potential kind of signs of outbreaks of disease or infection. But back in 1932, when it was the U.S. Public Health Service, they conducted this particular study to examine the natural history and progression of syphilis in African American or as it says, Negro men, with the initial declared intent of developing a treatment program for African American men. So that was the initial intent. The study enrolled black men who were healthy as well as men who were infected with syphilis, but did not tell them that they were sick. So enroll in our study, they would do they would do a blood test, and if you had syphilis, you could enroll in the study, but they did not say, by the way, you have syphilis. They didn't tell people who is who. So this kind of double blind process where participants were left in the dark. Normally it's researchers who are kind of left in the dark with these sorts of things, with maybe just numbers or coding attached to research subjects. And so the men who reported signs of the illness were told that they suffered from bad blood, which was sort of a colloquial catch-all term for a variety of illnesses in the Deep South at the time. Didn't tell them that they were sick or that they had syphilis, but told them they had bad blood. And then a few years later, in the 40s, when the wonder antibiotic penicillin was shown to be an effective treatment for syphilis, these people who we didn't tell were sick, who didn't know that they had the disease, who were complaining of not feeling or doing well, were then not given. They were denied the treatment. And so and it wasn't just that this was like, oh, we figured out how to treat syphilis, let's end the study. Keep remembering that was the initial intent of the study. It went on until 1972, and penicillin was treating syphilis and other diseases in the 40s. So this was a 40-year research program that occurred, and it's not too. So it was done by the U.S. federal government. And then in the middle of all this, we have World War II from 1939 to 1945. And while the Nazi experiments were arguably more immediately disfiguring, and probably at least in the immediate onset, kind of painful to the quote unquote research subjects, what occurred with the syphilis study out of Tuskegee and the medical experiments done in concentration camps, ethically speaking, we're not very far apart. We're not very, very different. And yet we kind of think of, the perpetrator in one instance of being, truth, justice, and the American way, and the perpetrator on the in the other instance as being horrible, fascist, abusive, murderous regime. Yet a little bit sort of similar in some of these things. You've also perhaps probably heard about, to kind of give another example, the Milgram experiments on obedience to authority figures that took place in the early 1960s, and have been the subject of some books, as well as a movie a couple of years ago with one of the SARS guards, the one who's not the one in it, but the other one who's also a little creepy. At any rate, the Milgram experiments measured the willingness of study participants who were men from a diverse range of occupations and varying levels of education to obey an authority figure who instructed them to perform acts that conflicted with their personal conscience. And these participants were led to believe that they were assisting an unrelated experiment in which they had to administer electric shocks to a learner, and that these fake electric shocks gradually increased to levels that would have been fatal had they been real. And so they were told, administer the shock, and it was, it wasn't really getting more intense, but they were told that it was. And you had research assistants on the project who were sitting in the next room, who would scream and shout and pretend to be in pain. And what they found, of course, was that though some were very reluctant to do so, a very high proportion of subjects fully obeyed the instructions that they were given. And so this isn't so much we're doing harm to the people who are screaming in the other room because they're in pain, but it's the psychological consequences for the participants who are led through this process of inflicting further and further and further pain on other people in the research process. And so this idea of deceptive practices in research. So the Belmont Report from 1979 was a way to, as I mentioned previously, to begin to take a stand on some of these particular issues. And there are three key principles in the Belmont Report that you should keep in mind as we move forward, not only in your work for the assessment course, but perhaps for this sort of quiz that might come up later. The first is the notion of respect for persons, which addresses participants' fundamental right to informed consent about the purposes of the study and what's expected of them so they may decide for themselves if they wish to participate. This is particularly important when we think about vulnerable populations, so persons who are under the age of 18 or persons with cognitive disabilities who may not comprehend the purpose of the study and therefore can't make an informed decision regarding their participation. For minors under the age of 18, we also withhold the right to consent, and it rests them with their parents or guardians. So, so that's why we can't simply go into a K-12 school or like a high school and kind of pull a bunch of 10th and 11th graders out of the classroom and have them participate in stuff, because we could, but we would have to go through a different process of parental consent instead. We also think about vulnerable populations being those folks who are incarcerated, so people who have been imprisoned. Because of the potential for their decisions being made under duress because of their incarceration. So, even though they may be able to fully comprehend what's going on and to assent, in an informed way, we have to be extra careful because we don't want to just kind of assume that someone is saying, oh, sure, like I'm glad to do this, because they could be doing so because they feel that it's sort of a condition that they must do because of the nature of their incarceration. The second of these three key concepts is beneficence, which speaks to our responsibilities and conduct of assessment, evaluation, and research to first do no harm to our participants and to maximize possible benefits to them. And keeping in mind that doing no harm means ensuring participants' well-being, including adding trigger warnings in advance of, thank you, jet plane, in advance of sensitive or disturbing content or questions, and providing participants with a break if things get too intense or tiring. So we don't want to, in any way sort of kind of put our participants in sort of psychological, physical, or other situations of harm. And think about, we also want to make sure that we don't keep them late. For example, we don't want to kind of harm them academically. Lastly is the concept of justice, where it pertains to the fair and equitable practices in selecting our participants, but also doing the sorts of things that we say that we will do. when we don't follow the procedures that we said we were going to follow, when we provide someone with an informed consent document and say, here are the study guidelines, here's what your involvement will look like, here's what we're going to then do with the data that we collect from you. Anything that we put in writing and describe to people and confirm for them verbally, and it's not sort of like a put in writing and describe verbally sort of a situation. If it's in writing, if we screw up the description or screw up the implementation of it, we really then kind of have a problem, because we've then violated these principles of justice. Because of course it's about the equitable kind of selecting and recruiting of participants, and we want to make sure that everyone who is a reasonable participant or kind of like fits our sampling frame or study design, and maybe would be a reasonable person to participate given that they're appropriate to do so, that we provide kind of equal opportunities for participation. But then once we get down into the process working with our participants, we have an obligation to ensure that we honor the word and the letter of what we have put in front of them to say, this is what the study entails, and this is what your involvement is going to look like, and how we're going to use your material. So that's the sort of very important concept of justice. So respect for persons, beneficence, justice, all important elements of the informed consent process, and things that we move forward with respect to data collection. So, how is this relevant right now? That's not at all how I wanted that to appear, but that works. So how is this relevant right now? Well, you're currently in the project design phase of your assessment projects, which is so incredibly exciting. And as you work through the project design phase, you are working towards or through things such as articulating and understanding the purpose of your project. And the project purpose will in large part determine the sorts of data sources, the sorts of data collection procedures, and the instrumentation that you will need to develop or identify in order to proceed with your projects. And so, depending upon the data sources, who are going to be your participants, and how then, are you going to kind of best work with them to collect the data that are needed. All of that requires kind of thinking through, how to have in place through your data collection process these sort of correct ethical procedures and practices. It's not just, let me kind of grab someone walking across campus and ask them a couple of questions. You have to have a process set up, where you can give them the opportunity to understand what it is that you're asking them to do, and then agree to participate in an informed manner. So all of these sorts of things with respect to ethics and the research process or the assessment process matter here at the design phase, because this is where you're actually making some of these decisions that will determine what sorts of ethical procedures and principles you need to follow, and how they will be followed in your work. Later on, we'll talk about assessment ethics as they pertain to things such as anonymity, privacy, and confidentiality. And it's always a bit of an interesting conversation or discussion because of how we tend to understand what each of these sort of mean in our sort of everyday context, particularly with respect to privacy and confidentiality. But those are important concepts to wrestle with as well, as far as they're concerned. Particularly with respect to assessment and evaluation, because normally, in this sort of real professional world, when you're engaging in these sorts of data collection experiences and we're interacting with human subjects on campus, you have a secondary responsibility, and that might be assessment, whereas your primary responsibility might be something related to student safety. You are a mandatory reporter, and so many of us are nowadays with Title IX and other sorts of significant issues on campus, that these ideas around anonymity, privacy, and confidentiality become a bit more fraught than perhaps they have been previously. We've got to think about how we can manage the data securely that you're collecting. So, do you have kind of a cloud backup service that you can use to store your data? Do you have a place where you can keep any sort of paper records that you have locked securely away, and kind of away from the eyes of roving roommates, or other sort of folks who might kind of see them? And it doesn't matter if their things are de-identified, or people oh, we don't care, I don't care about this. It's a violation of the ethical principles if you're not taking adequate care of your data. There certainly are lowercase p politics and uppercase p politics at play here, that intersect with some of the ethical obligations, and certainly things that were kind of, when we get into reporting out what our findings were, the P and P politics sort of situations have some ethical sort of implications with them too. But again, that is for another time. I appreciate your time and attention with this assessment sidebar, and I hope that you will take care.